Okay, so I will go ahead and introduce our next presenter, who is Joseph Madden from KPMG. Joe is a director in KPMG's CIO advisory practice with more than 26 years of experience leading and delivering engagements in the areas of software development, IT project, program and portfolio management, software estimation, quality and productivity, IT governance, IT budgeting, as well as client and vendor management. He is a published co-author of the books IT Measurement, Practical Advice from the Experts, and the 2016 QSM Software Almanac, and was a keynote presenter at the 2017 Federal Reserve Bank Planning for Program Success Summit. Prior to KPMG, he served as VP of Professional Services at QSM and is a certified Software Lifecycle Management tool estimation professional with over 20 years of experience using the SLIM tool. So with that, I will let Joe get started.
Good, great, thank you, Elizabeth, and it's definitely an honor to be part of QSM's 40th anniversary celebration, and I've been fortunate enough to be a user of SLIM and have a relationship with QSM for 20 of those 40 years. So it's kind of interesting what's transpired over those 20 years, and I thought it'd be fun to reflect on some of that. So going to the next slide. In 1998, there were 5.9 billion people. Now there are 7.4 billion. But what's interesting from a software and technology standpoint, back in 1998, only 3.6% of the world's population had connectivity with the internet. Now that's 54%. So 54% of the global population. So that's a very huge. I mean, that's just a staggering, increase in the number of people who are connected. What's also interesting, not a huge surprise in the largest economies in 1998 versus 2018, but you can see it was USA, Japan, and Germany. Now it's USA, China, and Japan. But what I think is more interesting is comparing the three most valuable companies back in 1998 versus 2018. And notice the only one that's the same, or that's still in the top three after the past 20 years. It's a software company, Microsoft. And now the other two most valuable companies are also software companies, Apple and Alphabet Inc., which Google is part of. Whereas back in 1998, two of the three, or only one of the three was software. The other was hardware and oil and gas. So definitely a lot of companies are moving toward becoming software companies, and a lot of companies that were in kind of traditionally in more hardware-focused industries are really more software companies now. And I've written about how the automotive industry is really now a software industry, especially with companies like Tesla. Some other interesting facts, back in 1998, there were 500 million connections or devices being connected to the internet. Now there's 8 billion. And then in 1998, the fastest computer, was 1.3 trillion calculations per second. Now it's 93,000 trillion calculations per second. So just staggering increases in both the usage and capabilities of technology. Some of the trends, in 1998 you had mobile phones, now we've got smartphones. You had client-server applications, now we have software as a service. The dot-com boom has become, digital transformation, management of information, or having management or data to manage organizations has now become big data. You've got, business process design has now moved to, intelligent automation. Video conferencing used to require a lot of, expensive hardware and video equipment. Now you can do it from your mobile device, et cetera. So it's just interesting to see some of the trends that we've had over the past 20 years. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm in KPMG's CIO advisory practice. And most recently I've done, I've been part of a team doing work for the DoD CIO, just looking at a huge, dollar value of portfolio and transforming, much of what they're doing. But I thought another thing that my colleagues in the CIO advisory practice have done is put out this huge CIO survey. It's called the Harvey Nash KPMG CIO Survey, and it's the largest IT leadership survey in the world. Nearly 4,000 CIOs and technology leaders across 84 countries have participated in this survey. So it has a lot of interesting insight into the challenges that CIOs face and some of the things that they're doing. And I encourage everyone to check out the details of this survey. You can easily find it by Googling KPMG CIO Survey 2018, or you can go directly to the link, which is hnkpmgciosurvey.com. So I just wanted to highlight a couple things related to my talk today. If you look at this infographic and some of the things on here, if you look over to the left at budgets, outlook, and priorities, the top three operational priorities are, improving business processes, delivering stable IT, and increasing operational efficiencies. And I would argue that leveraging quantitative methods, which are contained in Larry Putnam Sr.'s book, 5 Core Metrics, which Lenny talked about in the previous talk, is really critical to achieving those operational priorities. And of course, the SLIM tool and a discipline estimation approach is key to that. If you look over to the right, people, skills, and talent, a lot of CIOs responded that in part because of a skills shortage, they use a lot of, or a huge percentage of their work is outsourced. In fact, 46% of them responded that they use outsourcing, and 32% plan to increase their outsourcing spend. And certainly, for some of the work more recently that I've done at the government, the government definitely has a shortage of IT skills and does a ton of outsourcing work. So as you can see, my talk is probably going to be relevant to 46% of the CIOs who responded to the survey. So what is the challenge with outsourcing IT work and particularly software projects? With the government, particularly with the government, but certainly also in the private sector, outsourcing was supposed to make IT executives' lives easier. But unfortunately, without good discipline, in too many cases it's had the opposite effect, leading to cost overruns, inefficiencies, and solutions that do not work. So in the previous talk that you heard from Lenny, he shared some of the pain that his organization, has felt on the other side of bidding on contracts or selling IT work to to customer organizations. But there's pain also on the customer organization side if they don't have discipline on their end, because often what happens is they end up hiring providers that don't have the discipline that Lenny talked about. They award contracts to lowball bidders, that creates lots of problems. So 2 high visibility examples in government that you've probably heard of, and I picked 2 examples that many people have read about in the newspapers. One is called the Defense Integrated Military Human Resources System, or DIMERS. And this was an attempt to bring 4 military branches under a single payroll and personnel record system. Huge, massive effort. And unfortunately, it did not go so well, in a large part due to lack of discipline in estimation. And in fact, for this particular program, QSM was brought in, independently to do an independent assessment of the program, and they warned that the current plans were completely unrealistic. In fact, they provided a report that went all the way up to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, warning, I think at least 2 to 3 years in advance, that it was headed for a train wreck. And unfortunately, their independent advice was ignored, and the program manager forced an unrealistic delivery date, cut the testing phases, and it was just an absolute, it's probably an understatement to say it was a train wreck. After spending $1 billion and 12 years of effort, some of the highest ranking officials had to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And their quotes, this program has been a disaster. Secretary Robert Gates said, many of the programs that I've cut, have been controversial, but I tell you, this is not. When you have everyone agreeing that, program has been a failure, that's not a good thing. So that's one high visibility example. Another one is healthcare.gov. And again, that's one I think where, there are plenty of challenges, but it was I think an IT effort that was much more complex than people realized, and I think there just wasn't enough discipline applied to the sizing, scoping, and estimation. And here you have an IT project that was so had such a high visibility that here you have a 2-term president commenting that one of his biggest regrets was a failed IT project, and that gives you a sense of how much how prominent software is in the fabric of our society now. In the year 2018, the fact that we have a president talking about a software project as one of his biggest frustrations. So again, two high visibility examples. So what do you do about it? Well, there's a proven solution that Lenny talked about. Larry Putnam Sr.'s book, 5 Core Metrics, and way back in 1977, at the beginning of QSM's 40-year history, Larry Putnam Sr. discovered the physics of how engineers build software successfully. And what I found very rewarding in my own personal career over the past 20 years is the fact that, taking the time to really learn this stuff and get good at it, it's not like learning a technology that becomes obsolete in a couple of years. These concepts have stood the test of time through many changes in technology, methodology, approach, everything. The core physics of how people build technology, seems to be the same. So anyway, this is a very powerful tool that can be used not only on Lenny's side on bidding on contracts, but it can also be used by a customer organization to better plan and manage what they need to get done. So this next slide shows some of the best practices in procuring or outsourcing a significant amount of IT work, and also describes how you can leverage the 5 core metrics to apply a more quantitative method. Now, if you're not familiar with what the 5 core metrics are, and they've been talked about a lot in the previous presentations, but they're size, understanding the scope of what you're building. It's understanding productivity from historical data. It's then being able to estimate schedule duration, being able to estimate effort, and also being able to estimate and measure quality. So if you're paying attention to those 5 core metrics, they're very powerful in ensuring that projects are successful. And the larger and more complex and more high visibility a project is, the more critical it is that those 5 core metrics are leveraged. So in these phases of a best practice acquisition approach, in the first phase, as you're going through the planning, it's really important to thoroughly quantify the size and scope of required functionality. So again, kind of, tracing back to the previous presentation, you definitely need to have an approach of taking what's required and quantifying it, whether it's with ethics, features, and user stories, or some other method. And then it's also important for the customer organization to perform an independent cost and schedule estimate, using a tool like SLIM and historical data, so that you have some sense of what a bid should cost. Because if a customer organization doesn't do that, then they can easily fall victim to either a lowball bid that's totally unrealistic, or to a bid that's overly padded. So then when you move to requests for proposal, and a lot of even private sector organizations are starting to get more formal with some of their larger procurements, but certainly on the government side, you have a formal request for proposal. So it's really important to issue a clear RFP that has some quantitative information so bidders know the scope of required functionality that they're bidding on. It's also important to state any constraints, management constraints that are relevant, and to set realistic schedule expectations based on historical performance and ranked priorities. There's so many procurements, certainly on the government side, that dictate a schedule which may or may not be realistic and is often politically driven. So again, if a customer organization can get a good sense of what is a realistic schedule, then they don't fall into that trap. And then thirdly, it's important to require a vendor to report some well-defined and regular status metrics that are based on quantitative data, so that if you have a really big program like Dimers or healthcare.gov, that's going on for a long period of time, if you make sure you have quantitative data on progress, then you can really get some early warning and forward-looking forecasts of whether the program is on track or not. Then when you get to the third step of award, it's important to compare vendor cost proposals with an independent estimate. So in other words, what you've assessed that it should cost, and comparing with what they've come up with, and try to understand the differences. And again, it's important not to be misled by lowest cost and to be wary of the highest cost. And then also, it's important to perform a technical assessment of the vendor's past performance. And with government procurements, a standard part of the process is to provide a write-up of previous projects that you've done, and it's called past performance qualifications. But often in procurements, that's just a kind of a textual write-up of what's been done, and it's often hard to ascertain how big that system was that a particular vendor did before. Is it on par with what they're bidding on, or was it 1/10 the size of what they're bidding on? If they haven't done anything before that's the same size and scope of what they're bidding on, then that could be a source of risk, and certainly it's an important thing to be aware of. And then also it's important to do a technical assessment of the vendor's staffing plan. One thing that QSM has found with their benchmark analysis of thousands of projects is that many historical projects overstaff. They have many times the headcount needed to deliver a certain amount of functionality, and there's plenty of historical data to prove that smaller, more agile teams can deliver the same amount of functionality under a similar time frame. So it's really important to get a sense of whether the proposed staffing levels are appropriate for the amount of functionality being delivered. And then when you get to the kind of post-award phase, it's important to track and measure what's going on and to measure construction, not consumption. I've seen so many status reports on government IT projects where they report how many labor hours have been consumed or how much schedule time has transpired. That doesn't tell you anything on the real progress. So it's really important to have quantitative data on actual progress. For example, how many user stories have actually been developed and are working software, at least gone through unit testing. That's a more quantitative measure. But if you're just reporting, what's been consumed or a kind of a subjective checklist of tasks, that's not the same as quantitative data on actual delivered product. Also, defects are another hard measure of actual performance. Are defects being identified and removed in testing phases, and what does that tell you on what the product's ready or not? All right, so to kind of dig in a little bit more to the pre-acquisition phase, again, the important thing is to try to develop a should cost estimate, and that requires using a tool like SLIM to look at historical data, look at the scope of what you're trying to do, and if there's not a lot of detail, a method like T-shirt sizing, that's been discussed before, can be used. You can do sizing by analogy with other systems, but it's important to really get a sense of what it should cost. And it's also important to take some time to explore all viable alternatives. There may be different ways to achieve what's needed, and it's important to do that homework up front before asking for bids. And maybe in some cases, it makes sense to get some input from various bidders on different options. And the government has a formal process where they can do that, where they send out what's called a request for information, where vendors can provide their input to help shape the work that's going to be put out for bid. So just take a quick sidebar, and we've had some discussions about this before, is when you're talking about estimation and coming up with a should cost estimate, they're really, if you think about all of the estimation approaches that are out there, from my experience, they all really aggregate up into three primary methods. They're role-based estimation methods where you rely on subject matter experts to estimate the number of people that they think can be required to get the job done and how much time they think it'll take. So the advantage of, and this is probably one of the most common estimation methods, and like as Lenny mentioned in his previous presentation, it sounded like his architects were kind of following a role-based estimation method. And so the advantage of this is, in some cases, it can be done quickly, especially on smaller projects. But the challenge is that the estimates can vary widely. They can, vary as widely as you have, different subject matter experts. And often the core assumptions are in someone's head. And it's really hard to draw out something that can tie to math or a mathematically generated estimate. So often these are the least defensible estimates. So it's really hard to kind of rely on role-based estimates as your only approach. Then another kind of category of estimation is task-based, and that's where you kind of come up with a detailed bottoms-up work breakdown structure. So this approach can be more defensible because you have more detail, but the problem is that it's very time-consuming to build up a bottoms-up estimate, and often, from my experience, it often ends up being the best-case scenario. Maybe with some arbitrary management reserve where someone just adds on 10 or 20%. But usually that extra management reserve doesn't have any real math behind it. It's just kind of a swag or an arbitrary buffer. So that's a challenge, and especially in a more agile environment, and especially in a process where you're still trying to come up with a concept of what needs to be done. There may be a need to change what you're doing or look at a lot of different alternatives. And with a task-based estimation approach, you can't make those changes quickly. Because it's a very time-consuming method, it's not as responsive. And so it could be that there's a critical executive level meeting that's happening in a matter of hours. And if your answer is, well, we'll have to get back to you in 2 weeks, well then, you lose your opportunity to get, kind of engineering input into the estimates. And so what ends up happening often is, politically driven, deadlines and expectations. So with scope-based estimation, which the SLIM tool falls into that category, estimates are based on, scope and expected productivity. And it's the most defensible method. You have quantitative data behind the estimate. And if you're using industry trend lines and or your own historical data, you've got lots of points of reference to defend the estimate. And it can adapt very quickly to changes in scope. You can go run through all kinds of what-if scenarios. And, the only challenge is it requires specialized expertise. So it definitely requires, kind of building an internal estimation center of excellence or bringing in folks with the right expertise. So if you're able to leverage scope-based estimation, then when you do an independent estimate and you come up with one, you can compare it with both industry data and historical data from your own organization. So this can definitely be used to come up with a good kind of should cost estimate, and also to compare estimates from vendors that come in. So in this example here, this would be a good estimate, this red square, because it's in line with an industry trend line and also with the scatter plot of historical projects. So another key thing with, kind of leveraging a quantitative approach is you have an ability to mathematically, generate your probability of completing a project within a certain, duration and cost. And this is definitely important for planning, outsourcing when you're, CIO organization and you're trying to budget for what this, amount of work that you're outsourcing is going to cost and how long it's going to take. And it's important not just to look at one data point, but to look at the range of possibility and decide what level of risk you want to take on for that particular outsourcing project. So to dig into phase 2 a little bit, during this phase, it's really important, as I mentioned previously, to quantify the scope of required functionality, identify key management constraints, and to make sure you specify explicitly in your request for proposal that vendors are required to report quantitative, well-defined status metrics on construction progress and versus plan and defects discovered. If you don't put this in the request for proposal and you're in the customer organization, then what ends up happening is, in the middle of the project, when you want this data, some vendors will refuse to give it to you because they'll say, well, hey, it's not in the contract. We'll deliver when we deliver. And, that's not a good situation to be in. So you want to spell out, what measurement information is going to be useful in tracking progress. So some of the examples of status metrics and why it matters. You want to know, did the project start on time? When you're doing outsourcing, many vendors struggle with initial ramp up of a new project. And so by monitoring the plan versus actual staffing curve, so in other words, what was their planned ramp up of staff and what's actually occurring, can give you an early indication of whether the project is actually starting on time. Because it could be that maybe they have an appearance of having poor productivity, but it could just be they were slow to get started. So you want to definitely try to get some insight into what's really going on. Secondly, another key question is the project release on track to deliver? Well, if you measure the amount of functionality planned, for the next release that has been developed and unit tested, and the actual functionality has been developed and unit tested, that can give you a nice curve to do some forward-looking forecasting. And if anyone in the audience has used the SLIM control tool, that's a very powerful capability to use the same math that's in SLIM estimate to do forward-looking forecasting based on actuals. And you can actually use this method in the middle of a project, even if SLIM was never used for the original estimate. I've been on some projects, I've been asked to do independent assessments of high visibility projects where I've had to jump in the middle of the project, and I'm kind of asked, what's going on? We need a health assessment of this project, and just by collecting some basic, metrics on actual product construction and defects, I've been able to run some really powerful forecasts. There was one project. This was actually in the avionics, industry. It was close to 1 million lines of code, of avionics code, and I was able to predict almost 3 years in advance, probably 2.5 years in advance, the actual month of delivery. And the organization, the program office that they had at the time, they had an army of people using traditional, earned value and other, kind of program status measures, and they were showing everything green. And I predicted a 17-month delay, or that their actual date would be 17 months later. And sure enough, on the exact month that SLIM control showed, that was the delivery date. So it's a very powerful capability. And that's also important to, when you're tracking, the actual progress of your vendor that you've outsourced with. If you start getting off track, you can take corrective action. And if things start getting really bad, you have some quantitative data to terminate the contract if you need to. Hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but you have the data that you need. Another key question, will it be a quality product? Well, the cost to find and fix defects goes up exponentially over time. Studies have proven that. And so it's important to measure development defects discovered by month and by severity. And, that's an objective benchmark of the vendor's efforts to remove defects early through inspection and testing. So if you're not getting any visibility into, defect data until late in the project, that's not necessarily a good sign. That may suggest that testing isn't happening until late in the game, and you don't want that. You want testing to happen early and often, as well as inspections, to ensure that you have quality. And then fourth, the question is, has there been a major change in scope? Change can and should be embraced, but it's important that you understand and quantify what those changes are. Do you have 40% more backlog than you originally planned to have for the project? Are there more epics features and user stories? So it's really important to keep track of that. All right, so phase 3, award. So once you get bids in, and you're trying to, decide on a bid, it's important that the cost evaluation, weeds out vendors who appear to be lowballing to bid or, lowballing to win, as well as those that appear to be padding their estimates. And the only way you can do that is by comparing with benchmark data using a tool like SLIM. So here in this example, we've got a trend line. This dark blue line is an industry trend line, that's relevant to the particular project that you're estimating. And then the scatter plot is other, historical data that's relevant. So here you have vendor bid number 1 is way outside that history. It's well over a standard deviation, higher than average. So what this tells you is that bid is either implying very low productivity from that particular vendor, or they're really padding their costs because their cost is implying a low productivity. If you look at this other bid down here, it's the opposite. It's more than a standard deviation less than the trend line and history. So it's either implying a very optimistic productivity, or they may be lowballing to win. So, I'm not saying you automatically throw out, each of these bids, but you really have to look at them carefully and make sure that, they're not misunderstanding the work that they're bidding on, and that, you understand what an estimate should, the range that it should be coming in at. All right, so another part of the award phase is, making sure you have a rigorous technical evaluation. Unfortunately, with a lot of government procurements for IT work, what's called a technical assessment unfortunately ends up being an evaluation of the proposal writer as opposed to an actual technical evaluation of the vendor. And what I mean by that is you have, some government contractors have staff that are very good at writing proposals, very smart, can write up really good technical solutions, but they're not the people that are going to be delivering the project. Sometimes the delivery team is an entirely separate team. So, when you pick one of those proposals, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a project that's successful. And so it's really important to instead have some data that allows you to actually assess the vendor's capability and to get a sense of what you're really going to get. So this scorecard is kind of an example of how you can rate bidders. And when the government does procurements, they usually have some kind of a scorecard like this where they rate proposals on the technical side on whether they're on a scale from unsatisfactory to outstanding. So kind of recommended approach here is if you've got a vendor who can't provide any metrics on their past history. So in other words, for previous projects that they've done, they can't come up with any quantitative history on what they've done. Well, then that's probably a vendor that's high risk, and they likely have low process maturity. But let's say, on the other hand, they are able to provide some metrics, and it shows that their productivity is below average. Well, then maybe you rate them marginal. That hey, they're maybe not a top performer, but at least they can measure what they do and can predict what they'll be able to deliver in the future. Then maybe an acceptable level is where they have favorable productivity, but the proposed personnel didn't work on those historical projects. So there you're in a situation where the vendor has other parts of its organization that have delivered productivity that's average or above average. So that should, that gives you a good feeling that at least from a company standpoint, they have, teams that can perform well. But the team that's performing on this bid that they're submitting to you, they didn't participate on any of those past projects. So there's still some risk that, they hired a bunch of new people that, maybe aren't going to have the same level of productivity and performance. So then kind of, the best scenarios are when the personnel bid on the project, did work on their past history. So they're actually providing you quantitative history on previous projects, some of which are projects that the people they're bidding worked on. So that you can have a pretty high degree of confidence in. And then, of course, the best is when key personnel worked on the past performance projects and, the data shows that they're above average in productivity. So that's the best case scenario. So this is kind of a way that you can kind of bring in some quantitative data to this rating assessment and not just have it be subjective. And a challenge also with not using quantitative data is, from my experience, I've seen that on the government side, when they're doing technical evaluations of proposals, you would like to think and hope, if you're a vendor, that you have some of the best technical people on the government side evaluating your proposal. But unfortunately, that's often not the case. When they're evaluating a proposal, they often just grab whoever's available, and sometimes the people doing the technical evaluation, don't have very much expertise at all. So that's where it's really important to bring in a quantitative assessment versus subjective. All right, so then post-award, this is all about assessing progress against the contract baseline. So again, as I mentioned, if you've hopefully set it up in your RFP and required quantitative status metrics, then you compare the plan versus actual to make sure the program is on track. And then if you've got changes in direction proposed, you've got quantitative data to assess the impact to cost and schedule. And that's where the tool Slim Control can really be powerful. But even Slim Estimate can be helpful in doing that. So in conclusion, applying a quantitative approach with the 5 core metrics can really bring a lot of transparency into establishing a healthy vendor-customer relationship, especially on very complex projects. And when you have quantitative data, then your discussions, are about facts. And if you get into, challenges, which all projects do, you're having fact-based discussions instead of, kind of tense discussions, over people's subjective, opinions about, what the true status of everything is. So, from my experience, this can really help in providing a more robust process for ensuring that, customer organizations can get, get the quality and predictability that they want in getting new capabilities in outsourcing. And also it can be a great benefit to vendors because, with this approach, the vendors who truly are able to perform are going to be more likely to get work, but also you just have a more fair, way of assessing performance, and it just removes a lot of unnecessary rework. So I think that's, Elizabeth, that's all I had for my main talk. I wanted to allow plenty of time for questions and answers.
I have a couple that I've gotten. Some vendors consider their data to be proprietary, like labor rates, or if they're bidding fixed price, they may refuse to report cost information. How do you deal with these situations?
No, that's a good question. So with the 5 core metrics, you can still ask for vendors to report headcount without asking them to reveal their their individual cost or labor rates for individuals. If it's a fixed price type of contract, it's still important to know how many staff are being applied to the project. And, some vendors may argue that, that, it's none of the customer organization's business how many people they staff on the project. Some may have that mindset. But unfortunately, that shouldn't be, the right attitude, because it is a concern of the customer organization how many people are actually working on the project. And one of the most important reasons is that, the research that's been done by QSM and other organizations has shown that that staffing levels have a direct correlation with the number of defects. In other words, if you have, for the same amount of functionality, if you have a 100-person team versus a 10-person team, you may be able to deliver your functionality a little bit sooner in some cases maybe, but your level of defects is definitely going to be much higher. You have 100 people touching the design and code versus 10 people. And, after studying hundreds and thousands of projects, QSM historical data has proven, that consistent trend, that higher staffing levels for the same amount of functionality produce more defects. And so it's really an important concern of the customer organization to know how many staff are being applied. But as far as, labor rates, vendors don't have to reveal that. They can just have a fixed price and talk about how many, staff they're applying to the project.
I would argue measure quality not only by means of inspection and defect tracking, but also by static code analysis, applying a quality model based on ISO 25010. What is your opinion on this addition as an approach?
Oh, I definitely highly support that. And in fact, part of your, reporting of defects, during development can be from, from peer review inspections or any type of, static code analysis or even inspections of other artifacts like, your, requirements-based artifacts, your test cases, anything that's contributing to the quality of working, code. If you identify and remove the defects early, the earlier you do it in the process, the better off everyone's going to be. And there have been studies that have done. In fact, there are 3 independent studies that were done, and this is actually I referenced this in my chapter that I wrote in IT Measurement. Practical advice for the experts. But there were 3 independent studies that were done that all found that the cost to find and fix defects goes up exponentially through a given release life cycle. So, for example, if you clarify a requirements defect, as far as what the customer wants, that might cost you $1. If you wait until design or design activity, that's $5. If you wait till coding, and unit testing, that might be $10 to $20. And it goes up exponentially to where it's $200 post-deployment. So in other words, your technical debt is so much more expensive when you let defects go into production. So doing any type of peer reviews of work products, whether it's source code, test cases, requirements, information, that all provides tremendous value. And it's important, I think, in an outsourcing relationship for vendors to be encouraged to report, those defects, because it shows that they're trying to build in quality as early as possible into the life cycle. Because if those defects aren't discovered then, they'll definitely come out later. And a tool like SLIM can predict that, actually, with the predicted defect curves.
The pattern of poorly performing programs continues even when we have a body of evidence-based practices, including measures that, if used, will lead to a greater probability of success. So why is it PMs will not be disciplined about using performance measurement?
You know, that's a great question because it's kind of like, you know, if you know that you should quit smoking, you know, why hasn't every single person, or, you know, if you know that you need to quit smoking to reduce, you know, your risk of heart attack and cancer, you know, or lung cancer, why hasn't everyone on the globe, you know, quit smoking? So I think you know, the challenge is to, um, you know, I think for those of us that understand and embrace, you know, the concepts like the 5 core metrics and using a, you know, kind of a quantitative approach to improve project delivery, I think it's just important for us to make sure we're making that business case to key decision makers and make sure they can see and understand the historical data from past projects and especially past failures. You know, obviously you have the, you know, the adage, you know, the age-old adage, if, you know, if you don't, you know, if you don't understand your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And that couldn't be more true with IT projects. And I think the challenge is that because, you know, technology changes so quickly, it's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking, okay, I need to forget all the technology I learned 5 to 10 years ago because it's all irrelevant now, and I need to just clear my mind and learn all new stuff. So people tend to you know, not think too far back in terms of history and lessons learned, but actually there's a lot of lessons to be learned, you know, looking back, you know, 20 years or more. So it's important to understand that history. And just to give you, or provide, you know, one example, you know, I mentioned that Dimers project at the beginning of the presentation. You know, thankfully that history was recorded. And in fact, the quantitative analysis using SLIM, you know, that QSM did, as, you know, when they were hired to do an independent assessment, thankfully that analysis was saved. And when another high visibility program that was also, you know, not being planned well and was kind of headed for a train wreck, when that came up, that previous, you know, the Deputy Secretary of Defense pulled up a briefing slide with that previous quantitative data. And so then when presented with the new analysis of another program that was kind of headed in the same direction, you know, he basically forced that program to go back and replan and come up with a more realistic approach. So I think, you know, putting history in front of decision makers, you know, that's one of the, from my experience working with executives, that's one of the most powerful ways to get folks to embrace, you know, more quantitative methods. I think that's, you know, that's one of the only ways to do it sometimes, because it, you know, it's called a discipline approach because it, you know, requires discipline. You actually have to take the time and effort to learn this approach, which is sophisticated. It's not easy to develop the competencies, you know, required. But when you pay attention to the consequences of not doing it the right way, you know, that's what gets you back to the commitment to apply the discipline. So hopefully I answered that question.
What if vendors cherry pick past performance projects that are inconsistent with the project environment they're bidding in?
So, you know, that's definitely a challenge, and I think, you know, you have to make sure you ask for a good, you know, good description of what they did, and make sure you have some, you know, normally with the government procurement, with past performance references, you have to provide contact information, you know, for whoever the primary customer was. So it's important to take the time to kind of make those phone calls and understand, you know, what they did on their previous projects and really get a sense of whether it was relevant or not. because, maybe the vendor's arguing that these previous projects are relevant, but maybe once you get a better understanding of what they actually did, you may disagree and think that no, it's not, not as relevant. So that is an important step in the process, is looking at the relevance of past performance, qualifications.
Can you describe the process for evaluating an existing running program and how you are able to predict the likely cost and schedule outcomes?
Yeah. So with a program that's already underway, the best way to kind of get a sense of where they are and whether they're on track or not is to collect the 5 core metrics. And what I mean by that is you look at, well, first of all, you get a sense of what was planned. What's the scope of functionality that this project is supposed to be delivering. And sometimes for some projects that was so poorly defined that no one knows. So sometimes you have to do knowledge discovery of what everyone expects to get done for that project. So you got to do that first. Then you look at what was planned and how much effort is being applied to that project. And so you can get a sense of whether the original plan and schedule is realistic. Because sometimes just by going through that exercise, you may identify a huge red flag that it's a totally unrealistic estimate. But whether it's realistic estimate or not, once you can quantify the scope and you have a sense of what the plan is, then you can plug in the amount of actual, you look at the amount of actual functionality that's been constructed thus far. So how much code has been developed and unit tested, or how many user stories have been developed and unit tested, how many defects have been discovered to date, and you can look at a curve over time. And then you can plug that information into a tool like Slim Control, and it'll tell you what the actual productivity index is that program is achieving. And then you can run forward-looking forecasts to complete to see where that program's likely going to end up. And if it's looking like it's going to be way off track, then you can explore some alternative scenarios to get it back on track. Do you reduce scope? Do you adjust staff? Or in the case of one that I reviewed, it's clearly a situation of applying good money, or spending good money after bad, and so we helped the customer make the very difficult decision to cancel the program because they just weren't able to increase their velocity, and they were way off track, and we're essentially using the project to train very junior folks and weren't committed to quality. So those are the types of things you can do, and you can do it in the middle of the project as long as you can get that quantitative data.